without much further ado, then I'm going to just quickly introduce us to Nick, who will speak to us for about 15 minutes. So just a quick introduction. Nick is the Director of Global Justice now and has spent many years working with movements in the Global South on campaigns such as debt cancellation and restraining the power of Big Pharma, for example. He was really a big part of winning a law to stop vulture funds from using the UK courts to squeeze debt payments out of poor countries. So he'll be talking about trade deals and how that might threaten the NHS. So without further ado, over to you, Nick. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me. So yeah, I'm going to give you a kind of overview of why trade matters so much, not just to the NHS, but I'm going to particularly focus on the NHS, obviously. I think, you know, until a few years ago, a lot of people saw trade deals as largely fairly boring and almost exclusively about tariffs, right? The amount we pay on goods coming into a country. Actually, modern trade deals are very little to do with tariffs. I mean, they're there in some trade deals, but if you look at a trade deal with the United States, for example, we pretty much have free trade in that kind of traditional sense. So tariffs are very low. They could be brought down in a few areas if you wanted, but the gains would be fairly small from that. So the reason for doing a trade deal with, especially between two very developed countries like Britain and the US, is really to do more with what are called non-tariff barriers. So non-tariff barriers sounds like a pretty technical term, but actually it refers to huge numbers of things that we probably really value. Really, non-tariff barriers are kind of regulations, essentially. And you will almost certainly know, if you've paid any attention at all to the discussion so far about the possibility of a US trade deal, that one of the things that people are really concerned about are chlorine chickens and the possibility of importing chlorine chickens under a trade deal into Britain. Now, I'm not going to spend long talking about this because I am going to talk primarily about the NHS, but just so people understand how big the potential for a US trade deal is on many different parts of our society. Let me explain how this works. I'm an industrial farmer in the United States, and farming in the United States really is done on an industrial scale by and large. Of course, there are some small farmers, but by and large, it's industrial scale farming with very, very different animal welfare standards, very different environmental standards, and so on. Now, say I'm one of those farmers. I own an industrial farm in the United States, and I want to import my goods into Britain. I can't do that, but probably at the moment, because the way that I produce my goods is not to British standards. I am allowed to keep animals in much smaller containers. You know, cows that don't eat. Never eat grass and never see the light of day, and chickens that are really overcrowded, and which is why they use the chlorine wash at the end of their lives, because it's kind of to get rid of diseases and microbes and so on that are on them. And you're not allowed to produce chickens, cows, or pigs for meat like that in Britain. So as an industrial farmer, I go to my government and I say, I think this is really unfair. I want to import my goods to the British market. I'm not allowed to at the moment. I believe that's protectionism. And I want you to negotiate so that my goods are seen as equivalent to British goods under a trade deal. Right? And that would mean that under a trade deal with the US, all sorts of American meats and other foodstuffs would be, if they get their way, would be allowed to be imported into Britain, because those things would have been seen as non-tariff barriers to trade. Right? Of course, to us, we don't think about our food standards as a barrier to trade. It's a kind of it's what we've over the years democratically decided our food standards are going to be, because of animal welfare considerations, environmental considerations, whatever it may be. But under a trade deal, the only thing that's really important, the only thing that really matters, is the impact on international investment and international trade. So all of these standards are kind of reduced to just problems in the global trade system that needs to be kind of removed. And that's the big worry. So that's the worry for a lot of people, is that it wouldn't necessarily change the standards here, But of course, if you're a farmer producing animals for meat, or even vegetables, because vegetables are also produced under quite different standards, if you're a farmer in this country, that's going to be a problem to you, because suddenly you're competing against meat produced to a much lower standard. And so your only real option is to then go to your own government and lobby to reduce standards here too, so that you can compete with that meat. And that's how international trade deals have come to kind of enshrine this race to the bottom in international standards particularly over the last 30 or 40 years. So huge, and a US trade deal is particularly problematic to farmers here, because we know that agribusiness in the US has been lobbying very, very hard on these issues for a number of years now, but there are all sorts of other parts of society, cosmetics and so on, where standards are very different, and there could also be big changes to the kind of products that we buy under a US trade deal. But let me leave all of that to one side for a moment and get on with the thing that we're here to talk about tonight, which is the NHS. And obviously in the general election last year, there was lots of talk about whether the NHS was under threat or not. The government regularly saying it wasn't. The opposition parties, particularly the Labour Party, saying that it was. What's the truth of all of this? Well, there are four basic ways that we think a trade deal with the United States could very well be a threat to the NHS, and a very serious threat to the NHS. But it isn't the case that we sign a trade deal with the United States at the end of this year, and then next year, we put the NHS up for sale and sell it off to a single company. That's not how it's going to work. The NHS is not a kind of building you can just sell off. But nonetheless, it is under threat from a US trade deal in these four ways. First of all, modern trade deals tend to focus on how a government is allowed to provide and regulate public services. Right? So modern trade is as much about services as it is about trading in actual goods. And a service in trade terms is officially defined as something you can't drop on your foot. So clearly it includes things like healthcare and education, it includes hairdressing services, it includes banking, finance, telecommunications, etc., etc. So there will almost certainly services will be covered in a US trade deal. They're a very big part of the British economy. There is the possibility of opting out some services under trade deals, and that's what the government has said it will do. It has said it will opt out parts of the health sector from the provisions of a trade deal. However, we're very nervous about that, because increasingly in trade deals, there is a move towards saying everything is included unless you are really very specific indeed about what you're going to exclude and how you're going to exclude it. And we know so far from what we've seen is on the table that they do indeed want to take this approach of everything is on the table unless it's very specifically opted out of. And you can't simply say we opt out, the NHS is excluded. You have to go through line by line and think about all the different services the NHS provides and exclude them specifically. And if things aren't excluded, there are very often in modern trade deals clauses called standstill clauses and ratchet clauses. And what those clauses do is lock in and, as it sounds like, ratchet up or ramp up liberalisation and privatisation of certain service sectors. So the worry is that either the whole NHS, or more likely certain bits of the NHS, will find their way into the liberalising bits of the of a trade deal with the United States, and then will be subject to the disciplines of that trade deal. And what that will mean is, if it has a standstill clause in it, it will mean a government cannot go back and kind of deliberalise the bits of the service that have been liberalised. So we know already that many bits of the NHS have been offered out to private contract. We know already there is an internal market in the NHS. And what a standstill clause in a US trade deal could mean is it would be almost impossible to reverse those decisions. And what a ratchet clause would mean, if a ratchet clause is in there, is any action, any regulation a British government takes from now until we end the trade deal, needs to be in the direction of further privatization, further marketization, and further liberalization. So that's the first very worrying and most direct impact that a US trade deal could have on the NHS. It could lock into place the privatization that has already taken place, the contracting out and marketization that's already taken place, and make it very, very difficult for a future government to reverse that. Second thing Intellectual property. Intellectual property is something that has been in trade rules and trade deals since the mid-1990s. It is a particular concern to us at the moment because we're in the middle of a coronavirus crisis. And what intellectual property provisions in trade rules have done over the last 20 years is give big pharmaceutical companies far more power over their products wherever they're sold in the world. So they state things like, for example, as a minimum, a company can expect a 20-year monopoly on goods that they produce that have to be respected everywhere in the world. And in individual trade deals, that gets ramped up to an even longer length of time and gives pharmaceutical corporations far more privileges across the board. This is a real worry for us. Why? Because in the United States, they have one of the most free market systems of medical regulation in the world. So this country also has very strong intellectual property provisions, but in America, it is even greater. The reason being that the NHS at the moment has the right to negotiate to some degree. It can use its mass purchasing power and it can use guidelines produced by NICE to say, actually, that medicine is too expensive. It doesn't represent value for money. We're not going to have it. We're not going to offer it on the NHS. And that puts pressure on the pharmaceutical corporations to say, okay, if you're not going to pay that for it, we'll reduce the cost. So although medicine prices are extremely significant in the NHS, in fact, the rise in medicine prices to the NHS over the last 5 years, just the increase in medicine prices is more than the whole NHS deficit. So it's very substantial, but it is still nothing like the cost of medicines in the United States, where literally companies can charge whatever the market will bear. Interestingly, one of the possible treatments for coronavirus used by a company called Gilead is already on the market in the United States because it's been found to be effective against hepatitis C, and that's what it's used to treat. They think it might also be useful in the treatment of coronavirus. They don't know. They're testing that at the moment. This drug costs a few pounds for a course to make this. It is on sale in the United States for $20,000 for a course of this drug. So vast amounts of money that the NHS would not be able to afford, and so would either drive the NHS into a more private sector, private market oriented service, or would just mean that the NHS, users of the NHS just couldn't get access to new drugs, basically, and would have to take out private health insurance. And over time, this would begin to completely erode the basis of a universal public healthcare system in this country. We know very, very clearly that the United States wants pharmaceutical prices to be on the table. Trump has said without any question that countries like Britain are freeloaders of American research, and we need to change the way that we regulate pharmaceutical prices. So that is definitely on the table and open for discussion within a US trade deal. Third, I'll be very quick about this, digital. There are digital rights chapters in modern trade deals. This is a very new cutting edge area for trade, which essentially gives the big tech companies, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Apples, sweeping powers globally. So the power that they've currently got in the United States, it will extend those powers again globally. And what that will mean is a government like we have in Britain would find it very difficult to regulate big tech companies. It would find it almost impossible to put digital services taxes on them. It would find it almost impossible to protect our online data from being relocated to another jurisdiction, to California or wherever. But also, of course, big tech companies, the big prize when they're doing a trade deal with a country like Britain is the NHS database. The NHS database is the biggest database in the world. It is one of the richest databases in the world in terms of the data it's got. Private companies are already getting their hands on the NHS database. Again, a US trade deal will want to lock that in and allow companies to do as much as they can with the data that they derive from those service contracts. And then fourth and final point is that trade deals today are as much about investment as they are about trade. So they regulate they fail to regulate the rights and privileges of capital, of international investment flows to go where they want and do what they want in any way that they want. And the most obscene aspect of this is something called investor state dispute settlement. We call them corporate courts. They are kind of parallel legal systems, arbitration systems that exist within trade deals. We don't have one at the moment with the United States, but we do have one with many other countries in the world. And they allow foreign investors, foreign corporations to sue governments for taking action that said investor or said corporation doesn't like. Anything that potentially affects their profits or treats them unfairly. And really, if you think about it, I mean, almost any regulation is going to have some impact on some corporation or some business. That's normally the point of it. So the idea that a corporation can challenge that makes it that much harder to regulate. There are loads of examples of where this has happened because these things already exist. Most ridiculous one, which is often quoted, is Philip Morris, which makes Marlboro cigarettes, suing the Australian government because it wanted to put cigarettes in plain packaging. And Philip Morris saying, well, hang on a minute, when we invested in your country, we expected to make this amount of money. If you put cigarettes in plain packaging, clearly we're not going to make that amount of money. Therefore, you owe us the difference. Essentially, you've expropriated our expected earnings. But there are many other examples of governments being challenged, including over renationalizing elements of the national health insurance system in Slovakia. A company challenged the Slovakian government and won. So imagine, I mean, going forward, any attempts to better regulate our health system, any attempts to bring in public health regulations like sugar taxes or whatever is potentially open to challenge by American multinational corporations under a US trade deal. And we know that they are talking about putting one of these things into a US trade deal. And we know that, and this is when I come to the trade democracy point, we know that because we've seen papers from the talks that have happened so far. You'll remember in the election that Jeremy Corbyn held up some papers during one of the leaders' debates that were all blacked out. They were papers that we'd got released under freedom of information. We'd asked for the papers of the minutes and the agendas and so on of trade talks that had taken place already. The government said, we can't give you any. We appealed. On appeal, we got several reams of paper and we were very excited until we opened it and found it was almost entirely redacted, almost entirely blacked out. I mean, virtually all that was left was kind of page numbers. But a few days after Corbyn held those up, they were leaked onto Reddit. And so we know some of what's in these trade talks. And we know that essentially pretty much everything is on the table and is being discussed. But that points to a deeper problem that Sam mentioned at the beginning of the call, which is at the moment us as the public, but even our MPs, our elected representatives, have no official right to see the minutes of talks, to know what's on the agenda of talks, to know what our government's proposing, to know what the American government's proposing. In fact, our governments, the American administration and our government, have signed a letter that we had sight of a couple of weeks ago now, which said all of this will remain secret and confidential for 5 years after the trade deal comes into effect. So another 5 years after the trade deal comes into effect, we still can't see any of these papers. So it is unbelievably opaque. And worse than that, of course, that means our MPs can't properly scrutinize the government's trade strategy. But worse than that, even when the deal is signed and we can see the final deal and it comes back to Parliament, our MPs have no right to vote against that deal. They can say they don't like it. They can have a vote on it. That means ratification will be halted for 30 days. But after that period, the government can simply bring it back again. And an opposition doesn't have enough debates to give over to trying to stop a trade deal like this. So essentially, these things touch on so many different aspects of public policy that would normally go through consultations and parliamentary processes and evidence sessions and so on, that when it comes to a trade deal, it simply doesn't happen. It is regarded as a foreign treaty and therefore royal prerogative essentially guides the rules under which these things are agreed. We had made some headway in the European Union in recent years when we were still in the European Union. We'd made some headway on making the process more democratic, so MEPs now get a vote on these things and so on. But our MPs, no, we've gone backwards. Despite the fact that we have tried and we've worked, and when trade bill, which is the bill that's governing some of this stuff, appeared in the last Parliament, we actually got a significant amendment made that would have given Parliament much more power over trade deals. But the government looks like it's going to completely ignore this. In terms of the trade bill, which has just been reintroduced to Parliament now, it's got no ability for MPs to properly scrutinise or hold the government to account for this. So very, very worrying. We will, of course, try to put an amendment in again. We know there are Tory MPs who are very worried, like Jonathan Ginogly, who sounded genuinely quite pissed off in Parliament when this was introduced for second reading a few days ago now. But clearly they don't have the majority in the Commons. We may get something through in the Lords, we'll see. And of course, we encourage everybody to be active on that. But you know, with a kind of realism that this government does have a substantial majority. Now, the final thing I'm going to say is that this is all very scary and doom and gloom, and you might think I never want to hear about trade deals again. I'm actually fairly optimistic, because even though we have such little power in relation to this deal, a US trade deal is highly problematic for many, many people in Britain. You may be most concerned about the NHS, you may be most concerned about food and farming, you may be concerned about your rights online, you may be concerned about climate change, and believe it or not, in the leaked texts, the US administration has said there will be no mention of climate change at all in this trade deal. That's a toxic term in the United States, and we won't go there. So whatever it is that you're concerned about, likelihood is there's going to be something in this trade deal to worry you. And I think that means we can bring a grassroots coalition together to defeat this deal. And that sounds like a long shot, given what we're up against, but we've seen it happen. And that's what gives me hope and confidence. TTIP was a very similar deal that would have been done between the European Union and the United States. And we came together at the beginning of hearing about TTIP and knowing about it and finding out about it, and started campaigning. And at that point, we had almost no politicians on our side. We had almost no media on our side. You know, we'd go and talk to people and they'd look at us like we were conspiracy theorists talking about this stuff. Yet it took us a year, 2 years to come together as civil society organizations and activists all across Europe to actually change that, to really change that, and to make it look like they were actually going to lose if they ever brought this to a vote in the European Parliament. And it was off the table. It was scrapped. We won. And we've won on several big trade deals. A very similar trade deal to TTIP back in the mid-90s, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, it was called. Again, we beat it. We beat it through grassroots campaigning. We are going into this with many campaigners remembering the TTIP campaign and knowing the arguments. And that's really important. So we are well in advance of where we were on TTIP, on the US trade deal. And it is not just a left wing, it's not just for lefty campaigners. Over the last week, there have been 3 major articles in the Daily Mail saying a US trade deal endangers British farming and food standards. That's big stuff. There's been one comment piece in the Telegraph saying a US trade deal is a problem for British farmers. The National Farmers Union has had activist farmers all over the country writing to their local MPs, many of them Tory MPs, saying we are really worried about this. So the campaign has already started. When we add to that, I think the outpouring of love that we've seen for the NHS and those who work in the NHS over the coronavirus crisis, and open up a new front on that, I think we've got a really very, very powerful coalition there. And I do genuinely think we can stop this trade deal. And by stopping this trade deal, hopefully we can then say to them, we can make the case to the government, to all politicians of all parties, look, you're never going to get a trade deal through until you accept that trade is something which affects all of us, and that these deals are so big that they can only be passed if you have a proper democratic process, proper accountability to Parliament and the public for what you're negotiating away in our name. And that's where we hope to get to. And it's, you know, we haven't got long with it. They're hoping to sign a deal by the end of the year. I have to say, I'm very skeptical about that. They might sign something, but they're not going to sign a massive deal that contains all the things I've been talking about. But clearly this is where they want to go. And if we can stop them doing that, we make a very, very powerful case for democracy and accountability in trade talks. And I think we can change this system. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Nick, for the call to action as well as the really detailed and concise going over all the threats. That's fantastic. We're going to hand over in a moment to Ellen. I'm just going to give you a brief introduction first. So Ellen is the campaigns officer at We Own It, and she's campaigning for public ownership of public services. currently leading their campaign to protect the NHS from trade deals by organising mass training sessions, which we heard were going really well when we were having a bit of a chat before the meeting started. And as part of that, she's trying to help people effectively lobby their MPs to get protections for the NHS into law. So she's going to give us her take on what's going on at the moment. So without further ado, over to Ellen.
Thanks very much, Sam, and thanks, Nick, for that fantastic explanation of the danger that the NHS and other sectors face from trade deals, and really how including the NHS in trade deals means more privatisation, means an inability to reverse privatisation, which is the real danger here, and more corporate power in our economy in general. I've been asked to speak a bit about democratising our NHS in the context of trade deals and privatisation and coronavirus. So I will attempt to do that with the caveat that I am not an expert in NHS democracy or accountability, and it's a very complicated topic. But I do have some thoughts on how privatisation is tied in with the lack of accountability that we currently have. So firstly, it's just very difficult to understand the decision-making processes in the NHS. There are lots of people potentially responsible for making decisions, and it's very opaque. And if you don't know who's making decisions, who's responsible, then it's really hard to hold anyone to account. And broadly, our health system is not designed for accountability. You know, we obviously don't want a health service that is run by referenda, and generally would say, I think that medical professionals should be having a role in making decisions about our health service, but there is definitely room for lots more local and regional accountability, especially with regards to provision of services on a local level. And the reforms that the NHS is going through at the moment as part of NHS England's long-term plan are making this lack of accountability worse. Decision-making structures overlap each other, and that chain of responsibility is getting even more opaque. When we at We Own It wrote our report last year, Public Ownership 2.0, about creating democratic public ownership for the 21st century, we focused on water, energy, transport, and the postal service. But some of the principles from that report can apply to health as well. I'm going to post the link to a summary of that report, I hope that's okay, in the chat. So two of the big things that we found were important in increasing the democracy and the accountability of public services. One is having public duties for services, and another is maximising participation. So for public duties, we're thinking about things like decarbonisation, a duty to ensure universal access to the service, a duty to work with communities to make sure that the service works for everyone that it affects, and a duty for good land and asset stewardship, just to have a few examples. So we know this is relevant for the NHS because hospitals are being strong-armed into selling off land and buildings to make quick cash under the recommendations of the Naylor report. And the universal access duty is also relevant because continuing privatisation and underfunding is causing this rationing of services, is squeezing some people out of access to NHS services. And the NHS surcharge that was in the news last week is a big example of that. If NHS trusts or other relevant decision-making bodies had these strong public duties to provide universal access to services and other things, then these policy changes might be harder to implement. And on the maximising participation point, it's important for all public services to maximise the accountability and participation at local, regional and national levels. So of course the NHS is supposed to be a national body, and therefore decisions about it are made by elected representatives, but in reality decisions are made by NHS England and lots of other smaller bodies, a lot of whom have absolutely no mechanisms of accountability to the public. So you could have a CCG deciding to close an A&E department on the consultation advice of a private company from the US who's been drafted in to help make the NHS more efficient. And because of the opaqueness of these decision-making structures, it can be really difficult to resist. So an important thing to think about with democratising the NHS is how do we introduce more accountability into the local and regional decision-making so that these decisions are not made against the interests of the people who use the service in the first place. And as I said, part of the issue is that some of the bodies making these decisions are not public bodies. They're private companies, they're consultancies, and sometimes even US healthcare companies acting in a consultative role. And there's no accountability mechanism to influence these organisations. The other huge problem is much more sort of base level, and that is the logic of privatisation among the government and decision makers, which goes completely counter to public opinion. So we've shown in our very recent report, another report, sorry, called Privatised and Unprepared, the dangers that were caused by privatising key parts of the NHS supply chain and other elements of our coronavirus response. And this has meant that our response has been absolutely atrocious. I'm going to try to link to a summary of that report also. The complexness of this privatised supply chain, the layers of profit taking and of delegating responsibility means that government ministers barely know what is going on, let alone are in charge of the operation. And this logic of privatisation among government and decision makers, which is so opposite to the vast majority of public opinion, means that the direction of travel that our NHS is going down under these people is inherently undemocratic. It's against what everyone wants for our NHS. So it's clear from our report that coronavirus has not led to a change of heart about privatising health services. And in fact, there's evidence that the pandemic is providing a cover for even more privatisation. Private companies have been given responsibility for patients that they were not responsible for before the pandemic. And there are even some private companies who are pushing to take on more patients in the longer term under the guise of easing the pressure on the NHS as we recover from coronavirus. But of course, the real issue is that the public NHS needs more capacity to deal with these patients and always has. And the logic is always that if the NHS is squeezed, then we can rely on the private sector to take over some of that capacity and ease the pressure. And this is just a false solution to the problem that the NHS is underfunded, it's fragmented, and it's having the rug swept out from under its feet. So the public overwhelmingly agree the NHS should be publicly owned and run. And most people are unaware of the extent of privatisation that has already taken place in our NHS. So that's why, in the context of trade deals, when the government says they will never sell off the NHS, we have to be really, really careful, because we know that the NHS is already being sold off, as Nick said. If by sold off you mean contracted out to private companies to provide services for profit. We might not at the moment be outright paying to access care, unless of course you are a migrant paying the NHS surcharge, but the NHS is being privatised. On the other hand, there's a benefit to Tory ministers repeating the idea that the NHS is not on the table, as they did many, many times during the election. And that is that they're clearly still not comfortable publicly admitting that privatisation of health services is their goal. For other services, you'll get plenty of people on the right ready to argue for privatisation of energy, transport, water, but very few people in this country will argue for the privatisation of health. And the same goes for including health in trade deals, because as we've heard, that's very much interlinked. So that means we've got them on the back foot. And our campaign to pass an amendment to the trade bill that protects the NHS tries to capitalise on that advantage by focusing in on Tory MPs in marginal seats or new red wall Conservatives, anyone on the Conservative backbench who might be more vulnerable to pressure from constituents to protect public services. We don't need to convince them that including the NHS in trade deals is bad. We just need to convince them that the warm words of their colleagues are not enough to really protect the NHS. So as Sam mentioned, I'm running training sessions for anyone who wants to lobby their MP on this issue. And I'd love it if anyone felt inspired to act after this session and signed up to join our next training session. If I can be forgiven the cheeky plug, I'm going to post a link to our events page where you can sign up to the next training session if you're interested. On a slightly more strategic note, and very related to that poll question at the start of the session about whether the strength of love for the NHS will slow down attempts to include it in a trade deal, we've seen in the last 2 weeks that this government can be moved, even with its huge majority, if an issue is emotive and personal, and this ignites enough strength of feeling. So I'm talking about the NHS surcharge U-turn and also the response on the Dominic Cummings scandal. Obviously, the government hasn't backed down on that, but it is clearly under a lot of pressure. And that's because people have been really genuinely angry about these issues, and it's been connected to the real tangible impacts on people's lives. Now, trade deals are not usually seen as particularly emotional things, which means we have to work extra hard to find these real human impacts that including the NHS in trade agreements will have, and to tell those stories. And this is something we're working on at the moment at We Own It. And I'd be really interested in the Q&A to hear people's thoughts on the best ways to do that. And finally, just to finish up, I want to echo what Nick has said about his optimism on this issue. It is absolutely true that public love for the NHS has never been stronger and more obvious. But to stop this trade deal, we have to all have that optimism of the heart. So put aside your skepticism, your pessimism, and translate our love and pride for the NHS into sincere and persistent action, so that when you're talking to your Tory MP, they cannot argue with your strength of feeling on this issue. And so I would encourage all of you to get involved and fight for our NHS and our ability to regulate for public services in general.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Alan, for that inspiring call to action at the end. So we're going to move on to about 10 minutes of Q&A now, depending on how many we can get through and how the time goes. But as we're going, just either of you just feel free to kind of chip in on the basis of what you want to contribute to. So I wanted to kick off by kind of tapping a bit further into allusions both of you had made about how you're quite optimistic about this current moment. Now, campaigners might have thought at the beginning of the lockdown, oh, we can't go on protest, there's all these things we can't do, and this is going to be quite difficult. And in the same way, the government's ideological commitment to keeping things private and in some ways accelerating levels of outsourcing has been shown in the report that We Own It co-authored, showing how a lot of the problems with the PPE supply is actually down to the way that things have been fragmented over time. So are you feeling like the strength of that public love and the anger over some of the failures that have been shown can overcome that the government's obvious ideological commitment to, rather than taking the approach that will work best in an emergency, to just try and hold on to the policies that they've been following?
That's a really good question. I think there was a moment at the very start of this pandemic where we had an opportunity to push for the government to take a stronger role in the response. So the Spanish government, for example, sort of commandeered factories and took over private provision of healthcare services because, you know, they justified it as a sort of emergency situation. We obviously didn't do that in this country, although we were calling for it at the time. And so I think now, if we're going to take this opportunity and make the most of, as you say, the sort of growth in love for the NHS, we really have to make it clear that privatisation is a choice that the government's made, and B, connected to the failings in the response, because there is a danger that it'll just be seen as either ministerial incompetence, which there is also plenty of, or just, you know, this is just how it was going to be and no one could have done it better. So I think there's definitely an opportunity to tell that story, but it does need to be told really, really loud and clear.
Nick, would you want to come in on that one at all?
I think you're muted.
Should work out.
Yeah, sorry, it wouldn't let me unmute myself. Yeah, I am actually quite To a degree, I'm quite hopeful. I mean, it depends exactly what you mean. I think already the government was kind of on the back foot with the NHS. They realised how angry people were about the privatisation and underfunding that's happened over the years, and so they had to make certain pledges on that. Now, it's not that I believe them, but I think it's going to be particularly difficult for them to break some of those pledges, given where we are now, and given what has been said through this crisis on the NHS. So, you know, but also I think there's something bigger. There's two bigger things for me. One of them is that the crisis is just so enormous, and I don't think we've got our heads around the enormity of it yet. Not just in terms of the health crisis, but the economic crisis that will follow and what that means for our economy. That I think to go back to austerity and liberalization in this world that we're now living in would be very, very difficult indeed. I mean, just in some ways, it just doesn't make economic sense for keeping society going. And so I think you're going to see some quite unusual policies that we didn't necessarily expect to see forced on the government, whatever they want to do. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing that I've been increasingly, and I mentioned that, sorry, I probably wasn't supposed to be answering my questions in the chat box there, but waiting for you to ask me. But one of the things I've seen both with the US trade deal and with the Dominic Cummings stuff over recent days is our ability to overcome some of the Brexit wars and connect up Leavers with Remainers in terms of public concern. We've seen it with Dominic Cummings. Clearly, it's not just a Remain thing. It's very deeply felt across the whole of our society. But also, there was some really interesting research done by a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago, and it was looking at young Leavers in the red wall seats in the north of England. And what it found was they really like regulation. They really like regulation on the environment. They really like regulation on animal welfare standards. And they really like that regulation in spite of, or perhaps because they know big business doesn't like it. Right. And that's that's one of the big contradictions in Brexit, that basically they were sold something that was about providing security and protection and a better NHS and all of these other things. And the fact that that's not what the government actually plans to do is going to hit against a reality there. And I think on something like a US trade deal, it means we can bring together a really big and powerful coalition that absolutely can allow us to overcome some of the free market, the natural free market policies, which we know this government would like to engage in if it was able to.
Great, thanks very much, both. I'm just trying to get a sense of which questions still have to be answered, really. So one thing I'll throw in then is that we saw with the case of TTIP, the EU trade deal, that one of the reasons it was stopped was one of the regional parliaments in Belgium, I believe. Given the kind of like increased kind of conflict that's going on between the devolved governments here at the moment, with Scotland and Wales pushing quite different strategies and having maybe like a bigger ideological commitment to keeping the NHS public, has that figured at all in the strategy that might be taken somewhere down the road in putting up roadblocks to a trade deal? Obviously, there's no formal power for that, but it's an interesting sight in opposing that, basically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a platform, isn't it? They can't actually do it. They can't actually stop it. I mean, they can withhold consent formally, but it can be overcome. But it's an interesting platform, particularly because one of the things we've argued to decision makers in both Scotland and Wales is there are elements of this trade deal which actually threaten the devolution settlements of your countries, because, for example, Scottish Water is a public utility, right? Theoretically, under a I mean, we don't know if the British government would do this or not, but theoretically, they certainly could offer up Scottish Water to the service disciplines that I described when I was talking about the NHS. That would trample on the devolved settlement in Scotland. So it opens up really big contradictions. Not to mention, it's going to, of course, if we talk about farming, it's going to have specific implications for Scottish and Welsh farming. And unbelievably, I mean, the government, from what we've seen, has done no regional assessment of this trade deal and what it would mean to different parts of the country or to different sections of the economy. They just seem completely blind to that. And that's a massive problem, clearly, to the devolved governments. And so, yes, I think it will absolutely set up some real tension. I mean, there's already tensions, aren't there? But I think it will certainly intensify those tensions.
Great. Alan, anything you want to add to that?
Just that in our sort of conversations with MPs so far that our supporters have been having as constituents, there's definitely a lot more rebellious feeling, shall we say, among MPs in Wales and Scotland, even Tory MPs. And obviously, goes without saying, the SNP and Plaid Cymru are very, very opposed to the trade bill as it stands. But yeah, there's the most sort of optimistic I've been about Tory backbenchers sort of moving on this has been Welsh Tories so far.
That's really interesting. Okay, then one more question then that's trying to pull together some of the comments people have had is there's lots of references to kind of the way in which the NHS in England, at least, is not kind of one united body anymore, that it's someone saying like over 600 organisations between public, private and third sector, and both of you have talked about the role of that in being this kind of behind the scenes gradual privatisation thing, because people know how strong people's commitment is to that public service, that it can't be done in the open. Do you think that some of the failures of the pandemic are making more people realise how in some ways the NHS is not much more than a brand logo at times, and that we that level of fragmentation really needs to be resisted and pulled back if we're going to return it to its founding principles?
I think so. To be cautiously optimistic, I think it is kind of making it more obvious. And I campaigned on public ownership full time, and I didn't know the extent of the privatisation of the NHS supply chain. Like the levels of complexity there are just mind blowing. So yeah, I think it really is. And I also sort of slightly connected to that, the idea of bringing in social care into what we think of as healthcare is potentially going to be a bit more of a hot topic now that we've seen the failures in care homes to look after people, and the sort of the issues that have been created with devastating consequences of the fragmentation and almost total privatisation of our social care system, and the fact that it is devalued in comparison to healthcare, even though in reality there's not like a qualitative difference in what's being provided. The PPE was sent to the NHS first, prioritised over care homes. There were reports of coronavirus patients being sent back to care homes. GPs stopped visiting care homes. And the fact that there was hundreds and hundreds of different tiny private providers of care, meaning that you can't coordinate a sensible response in terms of distributing PPE and things like that. I think that's going to be a massive issue in the public consciousness going forward.
Fabulous.
Yeah, not much more to add, but I think Ellen's made a really good point there on care homes, which are already such a highly, not just privatized, highly financialized sector, owned by hedge funds and just fleeced for money. There's absolutely no way that will not be on the table in a US trade. It definitely will be. And you can only imagine. So I think that's a really good point, and something we should probably talk about more in the campaign, actually.
Right, back there. Thanks so much, both. I am just trying to fix my windows up. Okay, so what we're going to do now is split everyone up for 10 minutes or so into breakout rooms. So some of you will have done this already this week, but the idea is to have a bit of a deeper conversation amongst ourselves about some of the implications of what we've heard tonight and what kind of responses we should be campaigning on for that. So a few basic ground rules for it. When you arrive in your room, please amongst yourselves appoint a facilitator that will try and make sure everyone gets their say and can be called upon when we come back together towards the end of the call to summarize the discussion that you had. And just to reiterate again, be nice, act as if you would in a real conversation with everyone. So 2 questions for you to discuss in your groups. The first question is, what struck you most about what you heard tonight? So some of you may be very familiar with elements of the backdoor NHS privatisation, but some of you might have been shocked by the way that care homes are being financialised, for example. So what really struck out for you? And then the second question is, what changes to our political system would protect the NHS from these attacks in the future? So that could be really broad stuff like changing the way the NHS is held accountable. It could be the way that corporations are free to lobby governments pretty much unhindered at the moment. So we're going to put you into your breakout groups any moment now, and we will broadcast to you those questions, but I hope you have a good conversation. Feel free to take a camera break, folks. I might be doing that in a moment.
Very good. Thanks. That's good. So we're back in 15 minutes, right? 20 past.
No, so this is a slightly shorter session. So it's 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
I'll be back. Yep.
Great.
Just a quick message to anyone that's still in the main room. We're in our breakout groups now. If you're happy to just hang out here, well, until we resume the group discussion, that's completely fine. But if you do want to be put into a breakout room, just let me know and I'll put you in one. I can see there's a couple people in here just hanging out whilst we wait for the breakout rooms to finish. We'll be closing those in about 3 minutes time, and then we'll come back for our final discussion. We've just got 1 minute left now until everyone comes back from their breakout rooms. Twenty seconds to go.
You should do the countdown music.
We should have everyone funneling back in now. Let's give it another moment. Okay, let's pick up from there then. I think there were a number of people that were having to head off after the main talk, so we're a bit down in number, but that's not a problem. So there were 2 breakout groups in the end after shoveling a few people around. So there was one group that had, I know, Vicky and Karina in. Did one of you get appointed to feedback from your discussion for us? Can someone raise their hand and then I'll be able to unmute you? I'm not seeing any hands yet. Is there someone from the other group that wants to offer their thoughts from the discussion?
There might be a non-digital hand.
Oh yeah, who are you seeing?
I think John was waving. John Whaley, sorry.
Okay. Right then, John Wally. Okay, I'm going to unmute you now, John.
Right. Yeah, it was a non-digital hand.
Sorry for that, I can't see everyone.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. No, just one or two points from our group. I was in the same group as Karina, and unfortunately Vicky, we couldn't hear Vicky's contributions over a mic, so I think she desperately wanted to say something but couldn't hear. But what the things we discussed was the complexity of the situation and how everything seems to be interlinked. And it's a bit like a Rubik's Cube where you move one bit, but other bits will need to move and sort of fit in together as well. So it is quite a complex situation, but by the same token, not to get daunted by that, because it's this idea about, you know, this saying about, you know, if a butterfly flaps its wings in somewhere or other, you can feel its repercussions. So it's about appreciating the complexity, how everything's interlinked, but still being very positive and active. Other points that were made was about this idea about charities at the moment seems very big in the NHS, volunteers, all this naming of people as heroes, and the NHS isn't a charity, and we don't want to lose sight on what the NHS is. It's a public body, or it should be a public body. And on the other end of the scale, there's a load of private businesses making a lot of money out of the track and trace. And so what we need is a properly accountable and properly funded public NHS system. Karina, was there anything else?
Oh, I will try and unmute you, Karina.
Yeah.
Just briefly.
Thank you, Sam. So Andy made the point that the NHS is less concerned with health than it is with illness, and I thought that was an important point, and which kind of connects up to what it actually, the fact that it isn't actually national, it's not ours anymore. And I made the point that what came out of both Nick and Ellen was the way in which the whole of this process of neoliberalization of the NHS is gone, how far that's actually gone, and how it's not just in the last few, under the last government, but it's been going on for a long time. And without addressing that, I think that is my view, and that needs to be addressed in terms of political change.
Great stuff. Thanks so much. Okay then, so shall we see if Ellen or Nick have any final comments they want to say to round things up, or to respond to any of those things people have said?
Just to say that the point about the NHS not being a charity is a great one that I should have mentioned, but that has been a massive, there's a question about whether this crisis is going to lead to it being easier to sort of move away from privatisation, but that is a really worrying trend that we've seen, in that like the big outpouring of love and support for NHS staff has been funneled into these big fundraising campaigns, and the idea that we're raising money for our NHS is actually a fairly dangerous one. And it's lovely and it's amazing the amount of support and love that the NHS gets, and the things that people are doing in order to raise money, but it's also just a slippery slope towards the idea that this is our responsibility to pay for as individuals, rather than something provided by the government through general taxation and I've forgotten the name for the actual tax. Sorry,
National Insurance,
for a second. That's the one, National Insurance. So yeah, that, just to say, that was a really good point. Nothing else to add, really.
Nick, anything from you before we draw to
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I absolutely, definitely think it's time to think big. One of the things I touched on in my talk was the pharmaceutical system, which is a whole other nightmare that we're also campaigning on during coronavirus at the moment, to basically take power away from these enormous corporations that more and more don't even make their enormous profits by doing inventing interesting and important new drugs. I mean, they're highly financialized conglomerates, and they're not fit for purpose. And again, we should be setting up public, I mean, preferably international, but at least public research and development bodies, so that we can make the medicines that people most need, the life and death that the big pharmaceutical corporations aren't doing. And we can do it patent free, and we can do it so everybody in the world has decent distribution access to drugs that are made and so on. So I think that for one thing, and the other thing for me, and this is a bigger conversation about trade, is why on earth do we have these deals that kind of lock in liberalization and privatization and deregulation in this way? I'm not against trade at all, but I think we've got to look back to some of the post-war ways that people thought about international cooperation in trade, and look at trade deals and trade rules as something that can regulate big business, can regulate international capital flows, and can regulate trade and make it work for ordinary people, rather than stripping away any ability to control these flows, which we've seen the unequal economy that produces by allowing wealth just to kind of turbocharge flow up to the top of society. So it's time to really think big about these things. We have the opportunity, but unless we get engaged, unless we fight for it, things aren't going to go our way. So, I mean, I absolutely think trying to maintain optimism. They're scary times. Of course, it is scary, and it's really scary to think what might be the consequences of this, but at the same time, that's not set in stone, and just as a previous generation fought for the post-war settlement and the NHS to be established in the first place, and welfare state to be established, the idea that you can't leave all of these things to the market because it produces disastrous outcomes for many, many people. It's time for thinking on that kind of scale, and so yeah, let's try and be optimistic and look on and look with hope on what might come out of the difficult situation that we're in at the moment.
A great call to action. Thanks so much, Nick. And you just reminded me of how my grandfather, he remembers the time before the NHS was there and remembers very clearly what the differences were. So he's never going to forget kind of what we have and that we need to fight for it. So let's bring things to a close there. Thank you so much to both of our speakers for a really exciting and thoughtful discussion tonight. And really, they've both said how what direction things go in is really up to what we do now, and that it could go one of both ways. We've got a huge opportunity to use the public anger and the public clamoring for something new to really turn things around, so that the state is not kind of a way for a small minority to profiteer, but a way that we can actually express our democratic desires of the majority. So we've got one more session tonight that's going to be really exploring that in some more detail, where we're going to have Hilary Wainwright, who is one of the editors of Red Pepper and has done a lot of research and a lot of time thinking about things like participatory budgeting, which has really come out of Latin America, neighborhood assemblies and other more radical ways of thinking about how we can do democracy and not have politics done to us. And we're also going to have Christine Berry, who wrote a book about how a radical government in the UK could actually change things and put more power into people's hands rather than it just being handed over once every few years in an election. So we're really going to be developing our campaigning for after lockdown as a result of that session. So I'd really encourage you to come along to that if you can. So what we do next doesn't rely on one organisation or individual. These are big discussions that we're all going to have to keep talking together about. Encourage you to get involved in the campaigns that We Own It and Global Justice Now are working on, as you've heard about tonight, as well as our campaign for that to be underpinned, these changes to our political system to be underpinned by a new democratic constitution. So we're going to post a survey to you about how you felt tonight went. So that should be posted in the chat in a few moments. That'll also be sent to you via Eventbrite if that's how you registered for tonight. But get in touch with us, sign up to our email list if you want. But other than that, that's gonna be everything from us for this evening. So thank you so much again to Ellen and Nick for your time tonight. Really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sam.
All right, good night, everyone.